Welcome back, fellow shop rats. It's another Talk About It Tuesday, and today we're going to talk about, we're going to discuss, I'm looking at buying a project car, but I have no tools and equipment, and I really would like to do it the DIY way. What should I buy? What should I budget? Let's talk about it.
This is My Cars Shop.
If you're like me at all, you tend to be pretty much of a ready, fire, aim kind of person, and I see a great deal on a car and I just dive right into it and don't pay much attention to some of the other associated costs because I'm the kind of person that, I'll just figure it out as we go. But I realize that not everybody functions that way. And when you see what I do on the channel and you see what we do in the shop, you realize that I do have a lot of different tools and pieces of equipment, and it can mislead you into thinking that you have to have all the stuff that I have to do what I do. Now let me make it clear that things like the bead roller, the sheet metal brake, the shrinker stretcher, the TIG welder, and a few other things, those are recent additions to the shop. Those have only been added in the last 3 years. I've been doing cars for 40 years, so that should tell you something right there. I haven't totaled it up, and I actually think I did an episode on this a year or two ago, so it's probably somewhere in the shop updates tab or playlist, I should say, or something like that. But when you add up what I have into the shrinker stretcher, the bead roller, the sheet metal brake, and even the TIG welder, there's only a couple $1,000s worth of tools there, but that does add up. But I want to go and talk about the essential tools that you would need if you're going to start. Now, I already did an episode in the shop and I laid out some tools on the hood of my 1974 Dodge Dart workbench. So you can go find that one too, but I want to do this with a little bit of a different spin. So I'm going to approach this from the perspective of I have an empty garage and I've just bought a project car and I need to go and buy some tools. What do I buy? I'm going to break this down into 4 things that I'm thinking of right now. Cut, weld, bend, and bolt. Okay? What are the essentials? Well, if I'm going to cut stuff, I got to have some way of cutting stuff. And if you've been around a while, you know I do have a plasma cutter and a torch and things like that, but those aren't necessarily what I would call essential for what we do here. I mean, an oxyacetylene torch really is nice when you got that one bolt that is fighting you and you want to remain victorious, but is it essential? Probably not. I lived for many, many years without one, although I've had one for probably close to 20. When it comes to cutting stuff, I think a relatively inexpensive angle grinder and some cutoff wheels can do most of what you need to do, even up to some thicker metals if you're careful. And when I say thicker, I'm talking like 1/8 inch-ish. You can always use a hacksaw, stuff like that. But to do the stuff that I do here, something that will handle up to 1/8 of an inch or so is probably pretty good. And if you have something thicker than that, you can have friends or rent a tool or something like that. You've got to be able to cut stuff. And an angle grinder is multifunction. I have a very cheap Clark angle grinder that's not very well balanced and not very fun to use. But we also have a DeWalt in the shop that my son bought many years ago, and that's the one I go to. That one operates pretty well. And I think you can pick one of those up. I don't particularly care for cordless tools. Mine is corded, and I think you can pick those up for under $100. I would say that's a pretty essential tool if you're going to do any of this fabrication stuff like we do here in My Car Shop. If you're going to cut stuff, then you also need to be able to join stuff. That means that you're probably going to need some kind of a welder. Now, my Lincoln SP101 I have had for over 30 years, and I didn't pay anything for it. I actually bartered for that. I painted a 1962 T-Bird convertible for a guy way back in the late 80s, early 90s, and the payment for painting his car was the welder. So I bartered for it. I didn't pay for it. But even still, those welders are, I don't know what they go for now, I think back in the day I paid $700 or $800 for it. I'm guessing they're under $1,200 for that welder now. No, it was probably closer to $1,200 back then. So they're going to be around $1,000. There are cheaper ones. They were not available back in the day. There's a lot more DIY tools available, and you can go to Harbor Freight and look at that and do your research. I can't recommend one over another, but I will say this: don't use a flux core, use a gas, and make it a MIG, not just a wire welder. Metal inert gas is important. Use your argon CO2 mix gas. Your welds will be much better, and it's much better than trying to use a wire welder when the wire has to be as thick as a coat hanger to get that flux in the middle. So it doesn't have to break the bank, but it's probably the most significant expense that I can think of if you're going to get into this, because cutting it, okay, but you got to be able to put it back together again. Another thing, of course, that we mentioned was being able to bend stuff. Now, for many years, all I used was a bench vise and some pieces of angle iron to accomplish all of the bending that I wanted to do. And in fact, I would say that there's probably nothing that I've made on stitches that I couldn't have done had I had some creativity and just using the bench vise and a couple pieces of angle iron. So you don't have to have a sheet metal brake to do that. If you're inventive and creative and resourceful, you can make your own sheet metal brake pretty easily. There are some really good plans for very inexpensive sheet metal brakes that you can make that clamp into your benchtop vise, but that does mean you're probably going to have a bench and a vise. But there are ways you can do this without having that sheet metal brake. Now, the one I bought was just the cheapest piece of garbage I could find from Harbor Freight. It was $300, and I think that included the shipping right to my door, and I had to assemble it, and of course it didn't really bolt together properly, and I modified it a little bit and so forth. But if you want a bend that is fairly respectable, $300 is not a bad way to go. But if that's out of your budget, then you can use some angle iron and some creativity, or you can build your own metal brake. But I didn't have a sheet metal brake up until 3 years ago, and before that I did everything with angle iron and a bench vise. No problems there. You just have to be creative and inventive. Another way that I would bend metal sometimes is I would make my own little metal press, put pieces of angle iron and bolt it together, put the sheet metal in there, tighten it down, and then learn how to bend things that way as well. If you're going to bend stuff, the main things you're going to have is some really good, they don't have to be high quality, but you're going to have some dedicated body hammers. You can get those at Harbor Freight for relatively inexpensive. They have a nice little hammer and dolly set for like $50. It doesn't need many, and when you do have a set of those, you're going to have your favorite hammer. I have one hammer that I go to for almost everything. Last one on my list for today is bolt. That means you're going to have some basic hand tools, wrenches, maybe some sockets, screwdrivers, pliers. Maybe a couple pairs of tin snips might be handy for cutting stuff that I didn't think of that before. Now understand that I used to be I still am a certified, but I used to be a professional mechanic, and I have a huge amount of hand tools in my toolbox and stuff like that. But a lot of what I have is great to have, but not necessarily important to start if you're going to start from scratch. So just pick up some basics. You can get some pretty decent tool sets from Harbor Freight that can get you started. You don't have to go out and spend huge money for Craftsman or Snap-on or Matco or whatever tools you happen to like. You can get some pretty big sets for a couple $100 at Harbor Freight, and they'll do the job for you. Throw in a few add-ons like some decent tin snips. One spot I wouldn't cut expense on is your tin snips. Buy a good quality brand of tin snips. I promise you, you'll thank me for that later. And if you're going to buy them, buy all three. You're going to want to buy the green, the red, and the yellow, which it's right, left, and straight cut, because you want to be able to curl the metal off right or left, depending on where you're at, or sometimes you just need to make a straight cut.
Sorry, Gene Winfield, but I do use my straight cut a lot more than you would prefer.
You don't have to have a shrinker stretcher. You don't have to have a bead roller. I have a video over in the playlist called Fabrication That Doesn't Suck on exactly how you can make beads in metal without having a bead roller. There's many creative ways, and I think there's another, well, it might have been in that one. I know there's a video when I went around and showed some projects that I had done in the past and how I reinforced sheet metal without using beads. So there's other ways of doing things. This just happens to be the way that I'm choosing to do things right now. I do tend to separate the project costs from the costs of the tools and equipment, and I don't roll those into the cost of the project because I know that I'm going to be doing multiple projects with the tools and equipment I have. When I got stitches, I did decide to go ahead and buy the sheet metal brake, the bead roller, and the shrinker stretcher, and step up my game as far as how I was making things, both for efficiency plus just from the sheer volume of stitches being a massively huge fabrication project, much bigger than most people would tackle. And I knew it would expedite the process of getting things done. So rather than going out and spending $5,000 on floor pans and trunk floors and frame rails, I spent about $800 and bought those 3 pieces of equipment. But that wasn't project specific. That was for the shop, and I've already been using those pieces of equipment on many other projects around the shop. We've used some of that stuff on the 74 Swinger. We've definitely been using it on the Forsyth Duster. We've been using it on the 86 Dodge truck that we're painting for under $500. I've used stuff on the Oakland. I mean, I've used it on the 47 Ford. It's just, I use it everywhere, and so it's an overhead expense to me and not rolled up in the project costs. Let's face it, when you have tools and equipment, you can help other people out, and you can even do some work on the side and make a few bucks. And you know, usually those tools will pay for themselves if you're creative and inventive. Way back from in the days when I was a mechanic, I would always have the attitude that if I am going to do a job and there's a tool that I need, I'm just going to go buy it because chances are I'm going to need it again someday. And for the most part, that's paid off. I won't say always. There are some tools that I have that I've probably used once and not used again. But if you have connections with other people, you can definitely swap and borrow from each other and help each other out without having to go out and spend a fortune. The other thing that you can use but you don't have to have, and that's going to be more if you want to use air tools and paint guns and that kind of stuff. Then you're getting into needing a compressor and all of that stuff. There are ways you can do this without having that, so we're not getting into that. We're talking about the bare core essentials of I'm getting into my project and what are the bare minimums I'm going to need to spend to get started. There is none of those tools and equipment that I mentioned that you wouldn't need, even if you were going out and buying all the parts to install your car. You're going to have a way to cut stuff. You're going to have a way to bend some stuff because you're going to need to make little filler patches and stuff. You're going to need to modify stuff that you buy because it doesn't always fit right. You're going to need to burn stuff, weld it back together, and of course you're going to need to bolt stuff. So all of the stuff that we talked about in this video, whether you're going to fabricate or not, you're going to need it. So if you're going to get into the hobby, these are what I consider to be some of the essential tools. Now, I'm sure I've missed some things, but drop it down there in the comments. If you see something like Mike, you use your every day, we'll drop it down there in the comments because I just didn't think of it, and it'd be important for other people. My point in this is just like we don't have to spend a huge amount of money to do the cars if we don't want to, we don't have to spend a huge amount of money on the tools. My philosophy has always been, if I'll buy an inexpensive tool and if it's something that I use all the time and I wear it out, I might consider buying a higher quality tool later. It was that way for a couple of tools in the shop, and I did go ahead and up the game a little bit and buy some better tools. But you know, the difference between us and the professionals is we don't use our tools 8, 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so we don't necessarily need tools that are going to last 10,000 hours. We need stuff that's going to last for what we do. All right, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for watching. Rock!